Hello everyone, I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Today I want to tell you about something that happened to me while working as a police officer. I need you to understand something before I begin. This is not a story I tell lightly. For years, I kept most of it to myself. Not because I was ashamed, not because I had anything to hide, but because when you've been through something like this, when the very institution you gave your life to turns its machinery against you, it takes time before you can talk about it without your chest tightening. It takes time before you can lay it all out flat and say, here is what happened, here is what it cost me, and here is what I learned. I'm at that place now, and I think it's worth telling. I joined the Meridian Police Department when I was 23 years old. Meridian is a mid-sized city in the Mid-South. Not a small town, not a major metro. It had its neighborhoods, its rhythms, its complicated history between the police and certain parts of the community. I grew up in one of those parts. I knew what that complicated history felt like from the inside, and I joined the department anyway. Maybe because of that, not in spite of it. I believed, genuinely believed, that the way to change something from the inside was to go inside. My father thought I was naive. My mother prayed for me every morning. My older brother Marcus said, just make sure you know what you're walking into. I told him I did. I was 23. I didn't know anything. The academy was hard in all the ways they tell you it will be, and a few ways they don't mention. The physical part, I handled fine. I had played ball in college, kept myself in shape, and the conditioning didn't break me down the way it broke some of the younger recruits who came in soft from desk jobs and college parties. The mental part was harder, not the coursework, the culture, learning to read a room full of people who are going to be your colleagues, figuring out who was trustworthy and who was performatively friendly, who had integrity, and who was already calculating. You learn fast in a police academy that not everyone standing next to you is going to have your back when things get real. I graduated and was assigned to the 3rd Precinct. My field training officer was a 15-year veteran named Donald Marsh, a stocky, perpetually caffeinated man from the east side of the city who had seen everything twice and still managed to be funny about most of it. Don was good to me. He was direct, he pushed me hard, he corrected me without humiliating me, and he told me on my 3rd week, "You've got good instincts, Loxley. Don't let anyone talk you out of using them." I kept that. The 3rd Precinct covered a stretch of the city that included some residential neighborhoods, a commercial corridor, a couple of low-income housing developments, and the industrial district on the south end. It was busy enough to keep you sharp and varied enough to keep you from settling into routine. I liked the work. I liked the problem-solving aspect of it. I liked the moments when you de-escalated something that could have gone bad and walked away knowing no one got hurt. I liked the people. Most of them. I was building something. That's when Commander Harold Briggs entered the picture. Briggs had been with the department for 22 years when I first encountered him. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, with a broad, square face and the kind of posture that communicated authority without any conscious effort. He held the rank of deputy commander at that time, overseeing patrol operations across 3 precincts, including mine. He had a reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. Decorated career, multiple commendations, known for running a tight ship. Officers twice my age spoke about him with something close to reverence. My first direct interaction with him was at a precinct review meeting about 6 months into my time on the street. It was a large room, maybe 40 officers, and Briggs came in to deliver what was essentially a performance assessment of the precinct as a whole. He spoke well, measured, authoritative, no wasted words. He complimented certain metrics, flagged areas for improvement, mentioned 3 officers by name for exceptional work during the previous quarter. I watched him the way you watch someone senior when you're still learning what excellence looks like. I thought, that's what 22 years of this job builds into a man. He glanced in my direction once during the meeting, just briefly. I didn't think anything of it. The second time was about 2 weeks later. I was filing a report after a domestic disturbance call, and Briggs came through the precinct on some administrative walkthrough. He passed the desk where I was working and paused. He looked at my nameplate. He looked at me. He said, "Loxley." Just that. One word, like he was filing it somewhere. I said, "Commander," and he moved on. Marsh noticed it from across the room. Later he said to me, "You got a history with Briggs?" I told him I'd never met the man before joining the precinct. Marsh nodded slowly in the way he nodded when something sat uneasy with him. He didn't say anything else. The first real incident happened at month 8. I had responded to a call on Delancey Street, a report of a disturbance at a corner store that turned out to involve a shoplifter who had escalated and was threatening the owner with a piece of broken bottle glass. By the time I arrived, the man had corralled the owner behind the counter. I talked him down. 45 minutes of conversation, slow and patient, the way Don had taught me, and the man eventually dropped the glass and sat down on the floor and cried. He was in crisis, not criminal. He needed mental health intervention, not a charge sheet. I called for a crisis response team. We got him evaluated and transported. The owner was grateful. He filed a commendation letter with the precinct. It was sitting on the sergeant's desk 2 days later when Briggs came through again. Briggs read it. He set it back down on the desk. He said to the sergeant, within my earshot, and clearly knowing I could hear him, "Officers should have controlled that scene faster. 45 minutes is sloppy work." Then he walked away. The sergeant, whose name was Ernie Pullen, looked at me and gave me a small, careful shrug. The kind of shrug that means, "I don't know what to tell you, but don't read too much into it." I didn't read too much into it. Not yet. Over the next few months, I started noticing a pattern of small things, nothing individually dramatic. Assignments that were repetitive and low profile when I knew there were more substantive opportunities available. A training program in crisis negotiation that I had formally requested and been told was full, but I later found out 2 officers junior to me in seniority had been admitted. My quarterly evaluation, which Sergeant Pullen wrote as strong with specific positive notations, came back from the commander's level with certain language softened and one line about still developing situational confidence that Pullen said he hadn't written. I went to Pullen about that last one. I sat across his desk and I said, "Sarge, with respect, I need to understand where that language about situational confidence came from, because my read of the incidents over the last quarter is exactly the opposite of that." Pullen was an honest man. He looked uncomfortable in the way honest men do when they're caught between their conscience and their self-preservation. He said, "Loxley, you know evaluations go through the command chain before they're finalized." "I know that," I said, "and I'm asking who introduced that language." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I can't document a chain of custody on that, but I want you to know that what I wrote and what went through was not identical." He paused. "You should be aware of that for your own records." I thanked him and left. I went home that night and I sat in my apartment for a long time thinking about what Don Marsh had told me about instincts. Using them, not letting anyone talk me out of them. My instincts were telling me something I didn't want to hear. Over the next year, the pattern continued. I was passed over for a spot on the Community Liaison Task Force, a visible resume-building assignment that went to 3 officers who had notably less street time than I did. I was assigned to the overnight shift during a period when I had specifically requested day shift for a training schedule conflict, a conflict that was fully documentable and that 3 other officers had successfully used to adjust their shifts. My request was denied. Theirs were granted. When I asked for the reason in writing, the administrative officer told me that shift assignment was at the discretion of the duty commander and not subject to formal explanation. I started keeping a log. Nothing accusatory, just dates, times, incidents, outcomes. My handwriting in a small green notebook that I kept in my apartment. Don Marsh was rotated to a different precinct that spring. Before he left, he bought me a coffee at the diner 2 blocks from the precinct and he said, "Watch yourself with Briggs." Just those 4 words. I asked him to say more and he shook his head. "I've said what I can say. Watch yourself." He drove away and I stood on the sidewalk and I thought about how a man with 15 years on the job and a reputation for being a straight shooter couldn't say more than 4 words on this subject. That told me more than any formal complaint could have. My colleagues were complicated. Most of them were decent people. A few were very decent. A man named Tommy Reyes, who worked the same patrol corridor I did, was probably my closest friend during those years. Tommy was Puerto Rican, sharp-humored, devoted to his wife and twin daughters, and constitutionally incapable of pretending he didn't see something he clearly saw. He said to me once, somewhere around my 2nd year, said, "I'm going to say this once and then we're going to talk about something else because I need to keep this job. Briggs has it in for you and everybody knows it, and nobody's going to put their name on that because they like their careers more than they like being righteous. That's the honest truth." Then he changed the subject to whether the precinct coffee machine was a public health hazard and never mentioned it again. That was the reality. People saw it. Nobody said it out loud where it could be heard. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters enormously in a story like this. Commander Briggs was never cartoonishly villainous. He never used slurs. He never got in my face. He never threatened me overtly. What he did was more insidious than that and more dangerous because it was entirely deniable. Every decision he made regarding me could be explained individually as a legitimate exercise of administrative discretion. The problem was the accumulation, the pattern, the systematic nature of which opportunities disappeared and which hardships appeared whenever his hand was near my career. Taken alone, any one of those things could be explained away. Together, they formed something that anyone paying attention could read clearly. But paying attention was not enough. I needed evidence. And evidence of this kind of slow, grinding institutional prejudice is extraordinarily hard to build. I was 3 years in when I met Vivian Briggs for the first time, though I didn't know who she was. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was finishing a welfare check on an elderly woman on Caldwell Street, a routine call that turned out to be a neighbor's false alarm since the woman was fine, just preferred not to answer her door. I was walking back to my cruiser when I heard a sound from the alley between two buildings, a sound that resolved itself into someone trying and failing to change a flat tire. I looked in and saw a woman crouched next to a small gray sedan, wrestling with a lug nut and losing. I asked if she needed help. She looked up at me. She was in her early 30s, I guessed, with close-cut natural hair and dark, serious eyes that evaluated me and my uniform with the particular frankness of someone who had formed opinions about police officers and was deciding in real time whether to revise them. She said, "I've been out here 30 minutes and the nut won't break loose." I said, "Mind if I try?" She gestured at the tire. I got the breaker bar positioned correctly, applied my weight, and the nut came loose. I got the spare on in about 15 minutes. She watched me work with those serious eyes. "You did that before," she said. "Grew up fixing everything that broke," I said. "It was that, or pay someone." She almost smiled. "Me too." I didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. She thanked me with a slight nod that had a kind of genuine dignity to it, got in the car, and drove away. I thought about those eyes for a moment and then went back to work and let myself forget it. I saw her again 6 weeks later. The 3rd Precinct held an occasional community liaison event, a town hall-style meeting where residents could voice concerns about public safety in their neighborhoods. These were usually well-attended and occasionally contentious and always illuminating if you were actually paying attention to what people were trying to tell you. I attended whenever I could, off-duty if necessary, because I believed in them. She was at this one, sitting about 4 rows back on the left side, and she caught my eye when I walked in, and there was a brief moment of mutual recognition. I nodded. She nodded back. After the meeting, she came up to me. "You're the officer from the alley," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You got somewhere okay on that spare?" "I did." She paused. "You come to these meetings often?" "When I can," I said. "I think they matter." She looked at me with that evaluating look again. "Most officers I know send someone else." "That's why I come myself," I said. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, standing near the coffee table while the room cleared out around us. She was thoughtful and precise in the way she spoke, and she had specific, substantive concerns about police response times in her neighborhood, about how certain calls were being handled, about whether body camera footage was accessible to residents in disputed incidents. These were not vague complaints. She had clearly done research. I found myself respecting that even as I was fielding questions I didn't always have clean answers to. Her name, she said finally, was Vivian. She didn't offer a last name, and I didn't ask. "Cedric," I said. "Officer Cedric." "Just Cedric is fine. Technically, I'm off duty." She smiled at that. The first full smile. It changed the whole geography of her face. "Just Vivian then," she said. I drove home that night thinking there was something I should be curious about but wasn't ready to be curious about yet. We ran into each other twice more over the following 2 months. Once at the same community meeting, once when I happened to be on duty near the public library, and she was coming out with a stack of books, and we stood on the steps for a few minutes. Each conversation was a little easier, a little longer, a little less like strangers sizing each other up. She was a public health researcher at the city's university extension. She studied health outcomes in under-resourced communities, specifically the relationship between neighborhood policing practices and health metrics, mental health, stress indicators, access to care, so she had professional reasons to be interested in how the department operated, and she was thorough and serious about those reasons. But there was also something else in our conversations that had nothing to do with her research, a genuine curiosity about each other, a comfort that built itself quietly and steadily. I found out her last name in the worst possible way. It was a Thursday evening, mid-January, about 4 months after we first met. I was at the precinct finishing paperwork when Sergeant Pullen mentioned a deputy commander review meeting scheduled for the following week. Briggs would be presiding. Pullen mentioned it casually, the way you mention weather, and then he said, "By the way, his daughter's been around the precinct a couple times recently, doing some kind of community liaison study. You wouldn't have met her." I felt something still inside me. "What's her name?" I asked. "Vivian," Pullen said. "Vivian Briggs." I kept my face very carefully neutral. I said, "No, I don't think I've crossed paths with her." I drove home in silence and sat in my apartment for a long time with the lights off. Vivian Briggs, the daughter of the man who had spent 3 years methodically dismantling my career. I went through a period of about 2 weeks where I was simply cold in every interaction with her. Not rude, not obviously avoidant, just carefully distant. She noticed, she was too perceptive not to notice. The third time she registered the distance, she looked at me directly and said, "Did I do something?" "No," I said. "Something changed," she said. I looked at her and I thought about how to say this without saying too much. "I found out your last name," I said. A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not defensive, which surprised me, more like recognition. "Okay," she said slowly. "And that's a problem because of my father." "Yes." She absorbed this. She said, "What did he do?" "It's complicated." "Tell me anyway." I told her, not everything, not the full weight of it, but enough. I told her that I believed her father had consistently and deliberately impeded my career over the past 3 years, and that while I had no formal documentation sufficient to prove it, the pattern was real, and I had been living inside it. I spoke quietly and without heat. I was not angry with her. She hadn't done any of it. She listened in a way that people rarely listen, fully still, fully present, not preparing her response while I was still speaking. When I finished, she sat with it for a moment, and then she said, "I believe you." That surprised me. "You haven't heard his side," I said. "I don't need to hear his side to believe your account is true," she said. "I know my father. I love my father, and I know that there are things he believes that I've been arguing with him about for my entire adult life." She paused. "This doesn't surprise me. I wish it did." I watched her face. She wasn't performing sympathy. She was being honest in a way that clearly cost her something. "This puts you in a difficult position," I said. "Yes," she said. "It does." She looked at me steadily. "Does it mean you can't talk to me anymore?" I thought about it honestly. "It probably means I shouldn't," I said. "For my own sake." She nodded. "I understand." We sat there for a moment more. Then she stood up, gathered her things, and said, "If you change your mind, you know where I'll be." She left without looking back. I did not call her for 3 months. Those 3 months were not particularly happy ones professionally. Briggs was promoted to full commander in February, which expanded his authority significantly across the precinct. The following month, I was denied a lateral move to the investigations unit, a move I had applied for formally, and had strong backing for from Pullen and 2 other senior officers. The denial came from the commander level with no stated reason beyond operational needs. I added it to my notebook. 2 things happened in March that mattered. The first was that a junior officer named Kevin Walsh was caught on camera planting evidence during a traffic stop, a serious incident that led to an internal affairs review. I had worked adjacent to Walsh on a few calls and had nothing substantive to say about him one way or another, but I was pulled into the review as a contextual witness for the general conduct environment of the precinct during the period in question. The IA officer who interviewed me was a woman named Lieutenant Darlene Spite. She was professional, focused, and I noticed she listened more than she spoke. At the end of the interview, she said, "Officer Loxley, are there any other conduct matters within the precinct environment that you think are relevant to what we're looking at?" I paused. I thought about my green notebook sitting in my apartment. I said, "Lieutenant, I want to be careful here because what I could tell you is personal to my experience. and I haven't been able to fully document it. She looked at me with the kind of attention that comes from someone who has learned to read the spaces between words. Off the record for context, she said. What's your sense of the precinct? I said, there are people of integrity here. There are also people who have learned to look the other way. And there are people above the line who have more influence over outcomes than the formal process would suggest. She held my gaze. How far above the line? I said. Far enough that documenting it is complicated. She nodded once. She didn't push further, but she filed something away. I could see her do it. The second thing that happened in March was that Vivian called me. I picked up on the third ring. She said, I wanted to check on you. You don't have to talk to me if this is wrong. I said, I've been thinking. About what? About whether fear is a good enough reason to stop doing something. A pause. She said, Is it? I don't think it is, I said. I think fear is information. It tells you something is at stake. It doesn't tell you what choice to make. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. So what choice are you making? I'm making the choice to call you back, I said, even though that's not technically what happened. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and it was like a door opening. We started talking regularly after that, carefully, quietly, with full awareness of what it meant. We never discussed it the way couples in movies discuss things. There was no moment of declaration. It was more like a shared understanding that accumulated over time until it was simply the truth of what we were to each other. She was brilliant and principled and difficult in the precise way that principled people are difficult. She challenged things, she asked uncomfortable questions, she refused to let sentiment override analysis. She had complicated feelings about her father that she articulated with remarkable clarity. She didn't pretend he was someone else or excuse what he'd done. She said to me one evening sitting on the steps outside her building, he built his whole identity on a particular idea of order, of things being in their proper place. And somewhere in that idea, he decided that certain people occupied a particular place and that it was his job to keep things that way. I don't think he knows he does it. I think it lives in him like a language he learned before he could choose not to. That doesn't make it less damaging, I said. No, she said. It doesn't, but it's the truth, and I'd rather know the truth than a cleaner story. I thought about that for a long time afterward. We were together, in the meaningful sense, by early summer. I want to be clear about what that looked like in practice, because the reality of it was not dramatic or reckless. We were two careful adults who understood the stakes. We didn't appear together in any professional context. We didn't publicize anything. We existed in each other's lives in a sphere that was simply ours, separate from everything else. Vivian understood this without resenting it, not because she was passive, but because she understood exactly what was at risk and refused to be the cause of my professional destruction. She said once, "If this ever comes out because of me, I'll never forgive myself." I said, "If this ever comes out, it won't be because of you. It'll be because he's watching." She looked at me. "Is he?" "I think so," I said. "I think he's had someone watching for a while." I didn't have proof of that, but my instincts were speaking, and I had learned to listen. The discovery came in September. I learned about it secondhand, from Tommy Reyes, who heard it from another officer who had run into Briggs at the department gym and caught the tail end of a phone conversation that included my name and a level of visible fury that Tommy's source described as like watching a man discover his house on fire. Briggs knew. I don't know exactly how he found out. It doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that within the following week, the machinery of my professional destruction shifted into a higher gear. The first thing that happened was that I was reassigned from patrol to a supply coordination role, which was essentially an administrative desk position that contributed nothing to my skills, my record, or my visibility. There was no formal explanation. It was framed as a temporary reallocation of resources. I was 33 years old, with 4.5 years of solid patrol work, and I was counting paper supplies. The second thing was a formal complaint filed against me by a civilian who claimed I had used unnecessary force during a domestic disturbance call 5 months earlier. I had responded to that call. I had not used any force at all. The scene had been resolved verbally. There was partial body camera footage. The camera had malfunctioned at one point, which of course left a gap in the record. The complaint went to internal affairs as required. The third thing was a rumor that began circulating through the precinct. I couldn't trace its precise origin, but it moved the way rumors move in institutions. Quickly, quietly, attaching itself to people's existing unease. The rumor was that I had a problematic personal relationship with a department-affiliated individual. The rumor didn't name Vivian explicitly. It didn't have to. Anyone who wanted to understand it could. I watched people's behavior change around me. It happened with that particular social incremental shift that you feel before you can name. Conversations that went slightly quiet when I walked up. A joke that died half-finished. Glances that lasted a second too long and then looked away. Tommy Reyes remained himself entirely, as I expected him to. Two other officers I had considered friends found reasons to be busy whenever our paths might cross. I felt something during this period that I want to try to describe accurately, because I think people who haven't lived through it misunderstand what it actually feels like from the inside. It wasn't primarily anger. It wasn't primarily fear. It was a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being required to be professional and composed and excellent in every moment, while simultaneously knowing that someone with authority over your life is working actively to undo you. You carry two things at once. You carry your actual self and your job and your integrity, and you carry the awareness that someone is trying to make those things invisible. The weight of both at the same time is something that grinds you down in ways that are hard to explain to people who've never felt it. I kept going to work. I kept doing the paper supply job with the same diligence I had given to patrol. I kept adding to my notebook. The internal affairs investigation into the use of force complaint was assigned to a different investigator than Darlene Spite. This one was a man named Investigator Thomas Hamill, who was several years from retirement, methodical in temperament, and whose interviews with me felt less like truth-seeking and more like form-filling. He had the demeanor of a man managing his calendar to its conclusion. I answered every question completely and honestly, and submitted a detailed written timeline of the call in question that contradicted the complaint at every substantive point. The investigation took 3 months. At the end of it, the complaint was not dismissed. It was classified as inconclusive due to incomplete footage record, which was neither a clearing nor a finding, but sat on my file like a smudge. 2 weeks after that classification, I was formally suspended pending a broader review. The stated basis for the suspension was a pattern of conduct concerns under ongoing review, which was language sufficiently vague to cover almost anything and sufficiently specific to sound like something. I was told to surrender my shield and service weapon and to remain available for interviews. I was given no timeline. I drove home from the precinct that evening, and I sat in my car in my parking lot for a while before going inside. I want to be honest about what I was feeling. I was not destroyed. I wasn't certain I would be. But I was looking at a real and serious possibility that 4.5 years of work and sacrifice and genuine belief in this institution were going to be reduced to a file of unsubstantiated concerns and an inconclusive internal investigation. I was looking at the possibility that Harold Briggs was going to win. I called Vivian. She answered on the first ring. She already knew. She had heard from her own sources. She said, "Come over." I said, "Your neighbors might see my car." "Then let them see it," she said. "Come over." I went. We sat in her kitchen and she made tea and we talked for a long time. About the investigation, about what options I had, about lawyers, about going public, about all of it. She was analytical and clear, and she had clearly spent the previous hours thinking through the problem, which was its own form of love, the kind that shows up with a plan rather than just sympathy. She said, "There are other officers. There have to be other officers." "Other officers he's done this to?" I said, "Yes. You're not the first person he's had it in for, and you know it. The question is whether any of them documented it and whether any of them will talk." "That's a lot of people deciding to put their names on something." I said, "Yes," she said, "it is." She paused. "My father has a long career. There are people he's hurt along the way, not just black officers. He goes after people he perceives as threats, people who are smart, principled, independent. You happen to be all of those things in black, so you got the full weight of it. But he's done this before in other ways to other people." I looked at her across the kitchen table. I said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." She met my gaze. "I've been thinking about my father's legacy for a long time," she said. "Long before I knew you." She paused. "I love him." "That's still true. It doesn't change what he's done." I retained a labor attorney named Charles Okafor a serious, wire-thin man in his 50s who specialized in employment discrimination and public sector work. He had represented officers before. He knew the department. He knew what the language of these investigations actually meant. When I brought him my green notebook, I watched him read through it with the focused intensity of someone who was finding what he was looking for. He said, "You documented well. I had a feeling I might need it someday." He nodded. "The challenge is pattern evidence in institutional settings. You need corroboration. You need comparative data. You need to show that similarly situated officers, meaning officers of comparable rank, seniority, and performance metrics, were treated differently." He looked at me. "Do you have colleagues who might be willing to make statements?" "Some," I said. "The ones with the most to offer are the ones with the most to lose." "That's always true," he said. "Let's start with what we can get." Tommy Reyes was the first person I called. We met for breakfast at a place far enough from the precinct that no one would walk in. I told him what I needed. He was quiet for a long time, which for Tommy Reyes was highly unusual. Then he said, "I have a mortgage and 2 daughters in Catholic school." "I know," I said, "and I'm going to give you everything I have," he said, "because I have a mortgage and 2 daughters in Catholic school, and I want them to grow up in a world where somebody actually does the right thing when it costs them something." I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. "Thank you," I said when I could. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I might lose the mortgage." Ooze. Don Marsh was harder to reach, but not impossible. He had retired 18 months earlier, which changed the calculation for him considerably. When I explained the situation in a phone call, he listened without interruption and then said, "I told you to watch yourself with Briggs." "You did," I said. "There's a reason I only said 4 words," he said, "because I had about 400 words I was afraid to say." A pause. "I'm retired now. I don't have that same calculus." Another pause. "Send me whatever you need signed." There were 2 other officers whose experiences with Briggs preceded mine. One was a woman named Carla Watkins who had left the department after 3 years and was now working in private security. The other was a man named Jerome Tatum who was still serving at a different precinct, who had requested the transfer after a prolonged period of what he described to Okafor during a cautious preliminary conversation as deliberate and systematic marginalization. Tatum took the longest to come around. He had stayed quiet for years by choice. He had built a new professional life that worked. Reopening the old one meant reopening things he had carefully sealed away. What finally moved him was a phone call he received not from me but from Darlene Speight. Lieutenant Speight, it turned out, had been quietly paying attention since our brief conversation during the Walsh investigation. She had submitted an unofficial inquiry, separate from any active case, that flagged a statistical anomaly in disciplinary outcomes and assignment patterns across the precincts Briggs had overseen during his career. The anomaly was race-correlated and time-consistent, meaning the pattern held across different years and different precincts as long as Briggs was in a position of authority. She had built this without any official sanction on her own time, because something in our brief exchange had stayed with her, and she was the kind of investigator who couldn't let something sit once she saw its shape. When Okafor found out about Speight's parallel work through a contact in the IA office, he contacted her directly. Her response was immediate. She had been waiting for someone with standing to bring a formal complaint so she could open a proper investigation. She had the statistical analysis. I had the documented personal experience and the witnesses. The pieces fit together in a way that neither of us could have assembled alone. An independent internal affairs investigation was formally opened in late November, 7 months after my suspension. This is the part that people sometimes expect to be straightforward and triumphant, and I want to be honest about the fact that it was neither. An investigation is not a vindication. It's a process. And processes are slow, imperfect, grueling things that demand a kind of sustained patience that doesn't come naturally when your career and reputation are suspended mid-air, waiting for someone to determine whether you're worth anything. The investigation team included Speight, an outside investigator contracted from the state's attorney's office, and a representative from the department's diversity and equity office who had independently flagged concerns about Briggs's command record. They interviewed me 4 times over the course of 3 months. They interviewed Tommy, Marsh, Watkins, and Tatum. They interviewed Pullen, who was clearly relieved to say what he'd been sitting on for years. They interviewed 6 other current and former department personnel who had varying degrees of direct knowledge. Briggs, of course, retained his own attorneys and was cooperative in the measured, strategic way that people who believe their position is defensible cooperate, fully formally and fully without candor. During this period, my life had a particular quality to it that I can only describe as sustained uncertainty. I woke up every day not knowing which direction things would fall. I exercised, I cooked, I read, I talked to Vivian, I met with Okafor. I tried not to obsess and largely failed. I called my mother every Sunday and tried to sound steadier than I felt, which she saw through every single time, and addressed by cooking enormous amounts of food and leaving it on my front porch with notes that said things like, "Your strength is not up for debate," in her looping handwriting. My brother Marcus came to stay for a week in January. He slept on my couch, he went running with me in the mornings, and one evening over takeout he said, "You know what I think about the most from growing up?" I asked what. He said, "The way you always made things make sense. Even when they didn't. You'd find the logic in it. You'd find the through line. That's what you need right now. Find the through line." He paused. "The through line is that you were right and you kept records, and the truth doesn't change just because someone powerful tried to bury it." I held on to that. The investigation's interim report, released in February, was clinical and measured and devastating to Harold Briggs. Not because it used the word racism. It didn't. Not in those explicit terms. What it used was the language of statistical analysis, documented disparity, and administrative record. It noted that across Commander Briggs's career, officers of color at the supervisory level below his command had experienced significantly higher rates of adverse administrative outcomes, denial of advancement opportunities, and disciplinary classification as inconclusive compared to white officers with comparable service records. It noted that 3 of 5 formal complaints against officers under his command had targeted the same demographic pattern. It noted specific incidents, documented with specificity, in which his stated administrative rationale was contradicted by the contemporaneous record. It recommended the suspension of his command authority pending full review. The formal finding came 6 weeks after that. I remember the exact moment I got the call from Okafor. I was in my kitchen making coffee. My hands were steady. He said, "Cedric, the investigation has concluded. The findings are in your favor on every substantive count. The use of force complaint has been fully dismissed. The suspension is being lifted. Your record is being corrected." A pause. "Briggs has been placed on administrative leave pending a review of his conduct across his full tenure." The language the department is using internally is systematic misuse of supervisory authority. They won't necessarily make all of that public, but you and I will have access to the full record. I set the coffee cup down. I said, "What happens to him from here?" "He'll be stripped of command authority. The pension and rank questions will go through a separate process, and I don't want to speculate on the outcome. But he's done leading officers." I said, "Okay." Okafor said, "Cedric, I've been doing this for 20 years. I want you to sit with this." I said, "I will." I thanked him. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a while looking out the window at the February sky, at the bare tree in the backyard of the building next to mine. I wasn't elated. I want to be honest about that. There's something people expect, a burst of pure relief or joy, and it was more complicated than that. It was more like the release of something that had been held taut for a very long time, a long, quiet exhaling, the end of something that should never have been. I called Tommy Reyes first, because he deserved to hear it first. He said, "Thank God," and I could hear him exhale, and I could also hear his wife in the background asking what happened, and his voice going warm and slightly unsteady when he told her. I called Marsh, who said "good" with a simplicity that carried more weight than an entire speech. I called my mother, who cried, and my brother, who said, "I told you," the through line. I called Carla Watkins and Jerome Tatum, both of whom had given something real and taken on real risk and deserved to know the outcome of what they'd contributed. Then I sat down and called Vivian. She answered, and I said, "It's over." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you okay?" "I think so," I said. "How are you?" Another pause. "It's a strange day," she said carefully. "I knew this was probably coming, and I still don't entirely know what I feel. A beat. He's my father, even now." "I know," I said. "I'm glad you're cleared," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever else I'm feeling, I am unambiguously glad you're cleared." "Thank you," I said. "What happens now?" she asked. "I go back to work," I said, "and we figure out the rest," she said. "Together?" "If you're willing," I said. "I've been willing," she said. "You're the one who took 3 months to call me back." I laughed at that, a real laugh, the first full one in what felt like a very long time. Returning to duty was not the triumphant march that the story perhaps deserves. Real life doesn't move that way. I was reinstated to patrol to the 3rd Precinct with my full record corrected and a formal letter of apology from department leadership that was thorough in its language and clearly written by lawyers. Sergeant Pullen shook my hand when I came back in firmly and didn't say much because he didn't need to. Tommy Reyes brought donuts and made a speech that was technically about departmental procedural reform and practically about me, delivered in his particular voice that could turn anything into both a comedy and a sincere tribute simultaneously. The colleagues who had distanced themselves during my suspension handled it in different ways. Some came and apologized. A few were genuinely remorseful, and I believed them. Some avoided acknowledging the period entirely, which I understood even as I noted it. One man, an officer named Garrett Shields, who I had considered a friend before the suspension, came to me after about a week and said, "I handled this badly and I know it." I told him I appreciated him saying so. We didn't go back to exactly what we had been, but we maintained a professional respect that I think was honest on both sides. That's what happens in real life. Not every story has a clean ending for every character. The months after the reinstatement were a period of reconstruction. My file was corrected. My promotion timeline was reset. I applied again for the investigations unit, and this time, with Briggs no longer able to touch the process, the application was evaluated on its merits. I was admitted. The work of the investigations unit suited me in ways that patrol hadn't entirely. The slower pace, the documentation, the attention to pattern, those were skills I had been building for 4.5 years for reasons that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with survival, and now they had a proper home. Harold Briggs. I want to talk about him directly for a moment. He was formally retired from the department with a modified pension arrangement following a full review of his conduct across his career. The department never made a public statement that used the word racism. They used phrases like disparate impact and systematic administrative irregularities. The language was institutional. It protected the institution. He was not criminally charged because what he had done, while genuinely harmful, occurred in the gray zone of supervisory discretion rather than in the territory of prosecutable conduct. That is one of the most difficult truths of this type of harm. It is real, it is documented, it costs people years of their lives, and it is still not necessarily criminal in the precise legal sense. He was a man who had convinced himself that the order he maintained was correct and natural, who had built a 22-year career on the authority that conviction gave him, and who had done real damage in the process. I thought about what Vivian had said about the language learned before a person could choose not to. I didn't forgive him. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is something I hold for myself and my own peace, not something I offer to people as a resolution to their wrongdoing. What I did was understand him, which is different from excusing him. He and Vivian had a long period of what she described to me as suspended communication. Not estrangement entirely, but a deliberate distance in which both of them were deciding what the relationship could honestly be going forward. She called him. He answered. There were conversations that she described to me in pieces, careful and halting and real, in which he never said the words she deserved to hear. But something else happened, a kind of bare-faced acknowledgement, a silence that admitted more than his language could articulate. She said to me once, "I don't think he'll ever be able to say it directly. I think something in him will always reconfigure it into something else, but I think he knows. I think in some room in himself he knows what he did and what it cost." I said, "Is that enough for you?" She thought about it for a genuine, unhurried moment. "I don't need it to be more than what it is," she said. "I need to love my father without pretending. I think I can do that." She paused. "It helps that you don't hate him." "I don't," I said. "I did for a while. I don't now." "What changed?" "Nothing changed," I said. "I just got tired of carrying that particular thing." There's something I want to say about what this experience taught me about institutions, because I think it matters, and I don't want to just let it pass without saying it clearly. Institutions are not neutral. They carry the biases of the people who built them and the people who run them, and those biases don't disappear because the official policy says they're not supposed to exist. What happened to me was possible because the structures that were supposed to prevent it were insufficient, and because the people who saw it happen had their own interests that were served by not seeing it officially. That's not an aberration. That's how it works. The check on that system is people who are willing to put their names on the truth, even when it costs them something. Tommy Reyes, Don Marsh, Carla Watkins, Jerome Tatum, Darlene Spite. Those were the people who, in the end, made the difference. Not the policy, not the process, the people. I've been a field training officer for 6 years now. I tell every new recruit who comes through me something close to what Don Marsh told me on my 3rd week. Your instincts matter, use them, don't let anyone talk you out of them. I add one thing Marsh didn't say, which is document everything. Not because you're planning for war, because clarity has value, because the record is yours and no one can take it from you. I've also told them when it felt right, something about what it means to stay in an institution that doesn't always deserve you. I don't romanticize it. I don't tell them that loyalty to the institution is a virtue regardless of what the institution does. I tell them that there's a difference between the idea of what this work could be and the reality of what it currently is, and that living in that gap is one of the hardest things about this job, and that the people who do it best are the ones who can hold both without letting either one kill the other. I'm a sergeant now. Sergeant Loxley. That still sounds strange to me in a way that I think will always be slightly strange. The way a scar is always there even after it's fully healed. Vivian and I have been together for 7 years. We married 4 years ago in a small outdoor ceremony at her aunt's property in the hill country outside the city. About 40 people. Tommy Reyes as my best man, a role he treated with the precise level of excessive seriousness and inappropriate humor that it deserved. My mother sat in the front row and wept, beautifully, from the moment we started until well after we'd finished. Marcus gave a toast that was 8 minutes long and included 3 jokes and 1 genuinely moving observation about what it means to be a person of integrity in a world that does not always reward integrity, and everyone was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they know they've heard something true. Vivian's father attended. He sat in the 3rd row to the left. He was quiet throughout. When we walked back down the aisle and he stood with the other guests, he looked at me for a long moment. And then he nodded. Not the curt, dismissive nod from those early precinct days. Something slower. Something that I will not try to assign too much meaning to, because that's the kind of projection that leads you away from the truth. But it was something. Vivian saw it too. She didn't say anything about it for a week, and then one evening she said, "He nodded to you at the ceremony." I said yes. She said, "He's never apologized." I said I knew. She said, "I don't think he's capable of the full thing." But that was part of what he has. I said I thought that was right. She was quiet, and then she said, "Is it enough?" I thought about it, and I said, "It's what there is. So yes, I think it's enough." Our daughter is 3 years old. Her name is Nora, and she is, as my mother says every time she visits, entirely too smart for everyone's comfort. She has Vivian's eyes and my laugh, and neither of our patience. She is going to be extraordinary and difficult in equal measure. That is not the worst outcome. When I look back on all of it now, I look back on something that was genuinely hard and genuinely unjust, and that I somehow came through without becoming less than what I started as. That is what I am most grateful for. Not the reinstatement, though that mattered. Not the evidence and the investigation and the formal findings, though those mattered too. What I am most grateful for is that I didn't let what was done to me teach me to do it to someone else. That I didn't let the grinding unfairness of it make me small or corrosive, or a person who looks at the next generation of officers and thinks, let them figure it out on their own. I am grateful that it pushed me toward documentation, toward bearing witness, toward the belief that the record matters. There are officers out there right now who are inside their own version of this story, who are keeping their own green notebooks, who are watching the same patterns accumulate, who are trying to figure out whether what they're experiencing is real or whether they're imagining it, who are weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent. I want to say something directly to those people. You are not imagining it. The pattern is real. Document everything. Find your Tommy Reyes, the person with something to lose who chooses rightness anyway. Find your Darlene Spite, the person who is already paying attention and waiting for someone with standing to come forward. Retain someone like Charles Okafor, who has seen this machinery before and knows how it works. And hold on to yourself. Hold on to the reason you came to this work. Don't let them take that from you. It is the most important thing you have. I'm going to end with something simple. After I was cleared, after my record was corrected and my shield was returned and I was standing in the precinct again with my full self restored, Sergeant Pullen walked past my desk, and he stopped and he said, "For what it's worth, Loxley, I should have said more sooner. That's on me." He said it quietly, to me, with no audience. And then he walked on. I thought about that for a long time, about what it costs people to say true things, about the difference between the person who says nothing and the person who says something, even late, even inadequately, even to an audience of one. I've tried to be the person who says something. I don't always succeed, but I try. I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. This is what happened to me. This is what I did with it. And every day I go to work, I try to be the person I wish I had encountered at the beginning of this. That's enough. That's all I've got. Thank you for listening.